Today we're going to be looking at the biggest and the best contradiction from Vatican II. Now, before you start angrily typing out responses in the comment section, let me clarify 3 key words in that sentence. We'll start with 1, biggest. By that I mean the teaching from Vatican II that is most blatantly in tension with previous Catholic teaching. 2, best. I don't mean this ironically or best for Protestant apologetics. I mean best as in the teaching, though in tension with previous teaching, was actually quite good. Now, the absolutely best teaching from the council might be a stretch too far. There's probably others I like more. But still, this one's genuinely good. And 3, finally, the term that's potentially the most loaded is contradiction. I'll admit, I chose that term partially because it jumps out at you, but I don't think it's clickbait either. However, I will distinguish between 2 types of contradictions, and this is really important. First, we have infallible contradictions. Now, these are what St. John Henry Newman gives as the means of falsifying Catholicism, and they refer to contradictions between 2 teachings declared to be infallible by the Catholic Church. We could think of these as like capital C contradictions or fatal contradictions. Second, we have more generally the idea of 2 statements at odds with one another. In the context of this video, I'll also be referring to doctrinal reversals. When I do so, I do not have in mind infallible, fatal contradictions. Rather, I have a lower bar in mind of teachings that have substantially changed, such that what was previously taught is no longer taught. So if you agree with me by the end of the video that this topic constitutes a contradiction or a doctrinal reversal, that does not mean that Catholicism is therefore false. In fact, you might come around to thinking that the biggest contradiction is also one of the best. With all that being said, today we're going to look at the teaching of the Second Vatican Council on religious liberty, which is known by its Latin title, Dignitatis Humanae. Now, if you're halfway decent at Latin, you might notice that Dignitatis Humanae does not mean religious liberty, and that'll be important later on. My goal for this video is really threefold, and let me say at the beginning, it is not a work of Protestant apologetics. Instead, I want to, 1, unpack the substance of this controversy so that you can understand why the topic of religious liberty has become so contentious in Catholic theology. 2, show how this controversy opens up genuine theological opportunities for the Catholic Church. Opportunities I think are quite good. 3, I want to be honest about the real challenges that this controversy brings about, and thus perhaps rein in some of my optimism regarding that second goal. Okay, hopefully everyone's heart rate is back to a normal resting level, and we can get into the substance of this video. The document Dignitatis Humanae covers the topic of religious liberty and the duty of states to preserve the individual's right to follow their conscience in matters of religion. To modern Western people, this might seem like the least controversial of ideas. It's baked into the American ethos that people should have a right and freedom of religion. This was not, however, baked into the Catholic theological ethos prior to the Second Vatican Council. I will share but a few examples of Catholic teaching that firmly pointed in the other direction. We'll start with the 1832 encyclical Morari Vos, which states, "This shameful font of indifferentism gives rise to that absurd and erroneous proposition which claims that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone. It spreads ruin in sacred and civil affairs, though some repeat over and over again with the greatest impudence that some advantage accrues to religion from it." The famous, or perhaps infamous, Syllabus of Errors from Pope Pius IX in 1864 likewise condemned the idea that, quote, "every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true." Now, in contrast, Dignitatis Humanae states, "Everybody has the duty and consequently the right to seek the truth in religious matters so that, through the use of appropriate means, he may prudently form judgments of conscience which are sincere and true. The search for truth, however, must be carried out in a manner that is appropriate to the dignity of the human person and his social nature, namely by free inquiry with the help of teaching or instruction, communication, and dialogue." Now, building off of this, we should keep in mind that there was previously this kind of famous idea that error has no rights. But in contrast, the Council teaches the right to this immunity continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it. So even if you're wrong, i.e. not Catholic in this example, you still have a right to religious liberty, contra the Syllabus of Errors and other teachings. On the necessity of confessional states, that is, states that prop up Catholicism as the state religion, Pope Leo XIII in his 1888 encyclical Libertas wrote, "Justice therefore forbids, and reason itself forbids, the state to treat various religions, as they call them, alike, and to bestow upon them promiscuously equal rights and privileges. Since then the profession of one religion is necessary in the state, that religion must be possessed which alone is true," which again for him would be Catholicism. So while speaking of the rights of individuals and communities rather than religions per se, Dignitatis Humanae once again speaks in a starkly different fashion. It says, "The civil authority therefore must undertake to safeguard the religious freedom of all the citizens in an effective manner by just legislation and other appropriate means. It must help to create conditions favorable to the fostering of religious life so that the citizens will be really in a position to exercise their religious rights." And even in a hypothetical confessional state, the document goes on to say the right of all citizens and religious communities to religious freedom must be recognized and respected as well. So, at this point, I think the contrast, indeed contradiction, between 19th century papal teaching and the 20th century council should just be manifestly obvious. But lest you think I'm making this up or I'm seeing tension where there is none, listen to how the following Catholic theologians have described the differences. We'll start with Pope Benedict XVI, a theologian at the council and, no theological lightweight. He said of this document, "There was in St. Peter's the sense that here was the end of the Middle Ages, the end even of the Constantinian age." Certainly, he thought something momentous had happened. Cardinal Avery Dulles writes that this document, quote, "represents an undeniable, even a dramatic shift." And finally, as just one more example, Larry Chapp writes, "One cannot escape the conclusion, therefore, that Dignitatis Humanae is saying that on the topic of human dignity and religious freedom, the Church has erred in the past, often with deadly consequences, and that she has erred precisely because she has failed to grasp the deeper implications of her own Christological treasury. Therefore, the traditionalists are correct that Dignitatis Humanae and the Council in general were promoting a profound change of orientation in the Church's theological methodology. I just think they are wrong to oppose these changes." And I think Chapp is absolutely correct here, but more on that later. Put simply, there's obviously a tension here. To pretend otherwise seems either disingenuous or just kind of ill-informed. However, that's not to say the tension is irreconcilable. That's really important. Later in this video, we'll see how Catholic theologians have sought to do precisely that in the years since the Council, and Chapp's quote already gives some of the keys to that. One thing I think is instructive to note on this topic of interpreting Vatican II is the way it has changed over time. John O'Malley, writer of one of the most influential histories of the Council in English, notes the irony that during the Council, the conservative bishops in the minority fiercely attacked Dignitatis Humanae as novel and out of step with the tradition, while the majority bishops, who were more theologically progressive, defended it as at least vaguely in line with the tradition. After the Council, the opposite seemed to occur, with conservative apologists trying to rescue the document from any sense of rupture with the tradition, while progressives were happy to declare it out of step and hopefully other things could be changed as well. Figures like Benedict XVI, however, offered a middle path, interpreting this document and others as indicative of both continuity and discontinuity between Vatican II and previous teaching. To understand what that means, we'll now look at how the Catholic theologian can make sense of this. As we've seen, there are clear points of discontinuity between Vatican II and previous teaching on the topic of religious liberty. Catholic theologians, in the main, do not simply pretend this isn't there. Instead, there are two key theological moves that are made to rescue the document from fatal, capital C, contradiction. Hey, before we get into these kind of two ways of making sense of what's going on here, I want to say a quick thank you to my patrons. Look, I can't do this without the support of my patrons. This is now my full-time job, and to be able to do the research for these videos, put these scripts together, edit them, all of that, it takes a lot of time, and it's the honor of my lifetime to be able to do it. But it's only possible because of my patrons. So if you want to help more people be able to make sense, not just of what's going on in this video, but of historical theology generally, and you find my channel helpful in that, well then I would be honored if you'd consider supporting the channel at patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. When you do that, you'll get all types of fun perks, including access to my book club where we're reading Irenaeus Against Heresies. Together, you'll get all the videos early and ad-free, and tons of other fun stuff. So if you want to help this channel keep going and growing, consider going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Okay. Back to the video. First, there's a point about the levels of teaching and their doctrinal weight. I mentioned earlier that Newman's test case for falsifiability is two teachings that contradict one another of equal infallible weight. However, as Thomas Guarino is at constant pains to point out in his really helpful book, The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II, the prior teachings on religious liberty were not infallible definitions, nor were those at Vatican II for that matter. More on that later. In any case, as he reiterates time and again, even authentic teachings of the ordinary magisterium can be corrected. But that doesn't mean they can be ignored either. Once again, stay tuned for more on that. Second, there is a really interesting move by theologians, which is to dispute what the core teaching of Dignitatis Humanae really is. Remember how I said that Dignitatis Humanae doesn't mean religious liberty and that would be important? Well, here we go. Catholic theologians like Guarino will say that yes, the teaching on religious liberty is at odds with prior Catholic teaching. However, there's a deeper idea animating the document that is in line with prior Catholic teaching, and that is the idea of human dignity, from which the document gets its title. In a similar vein, Larry Chapp argues that while the teaching on religious liberty is obviously at odds with what came before it, the core of Dignitatis Humanae is actually a development in the teaching on the Christological nature of truth that leads to a vision of truth as relational rather than coercive, because truth is ultimately a person in Christ. And honestly, I find that really interesting. Anyway, in making these moves, Catholic theologians can recognize discontinuity and continuity in the same document by distinguishing between the core teaching and secondary teachings or implications of a document. This also pulls on a well-known concept of the hierarchy of truths, in which some are simply more fundamental than others. Now, put together, these ideas actually give me a lot of hope for Catholic theology. This is where I'm not being ironic in calling this the best contradiction. One of my biggest critiques of Catholic theology has been that in proclaiming itself to teach unchanging doctrines, and thus tying itself to previous formulations, it becomes irreformable and forces itself into knots. While the latter admittedly might seem more or less true, depending on which theologian you're reading and how tortured an explanation might seem on the surface, the former, that Catholic teaching can't be reformed, is manifestly contradicted by Vatican II. To put it slightly provocatively, Vatican II contradicts the idea that the Church can't reform its past authentic teachings by contradicting its past authentic teachings in the name of more fundamental teachings. And if the Church is going to take seriously the need for reform, which I think it should, and by that I don't mean become Protestant, it will need to be able to demonstrate this level of theological flexibility. And this gives us a glimpse into three ideas that animated the Second Vatican Council: development, ressourcement, and aggiornamento. I hope in the future to make a broader video on the theological vision of Vatican II, since, as I hope is clear at this point, I think quite highly of the Council. For now, though, let me briefly explain how these three ideas show up here, because they are absolutely essential to making sense of the theological trajectory set by this Council. First, we have development. The idea that doctrine develops over time is not a new or modern innovation. We find this all the way back with St. Vincent of Lerins, who insists that Christian understanding grows over time. He contrasts growth with change. Now, the latter is a permutation of the faith, such that we're forced to say what used to be true is no longer true. He doesn't like that. But growth is natural and good, like an infant becoming a full-grown adult. So too does the Church's understanding grow over time. In later centuries, St. John Henry Newman would further develop this idea. No pun intended. And for a deep dive on his views, you can check out one of the links up here. As it relates to religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae explicitly states that it is a work of development. The introduction to the document says, in dealing with this question of liberty, the Sacred Council intends to develop the teaching of recent popes on the inviolable right of the human person and on the constitutional order of society. And on this point, we do see a gradual development antedating the council, with the theme of human dignity beginning to take on more importance. The next idea is ressourcement, which is the idea of retrieving the wisdom of the past for use in the present. Now, this is often misunderstood as the attempt to bypass the problems of the Middle Ages with the better theology of the patristic period. Properly speaking, though, ressourcement is about a holistic account of the tradition that seeks to balance out potentially lopsided views in the present. So in any given age, you might become over-enamored with one sliver of the truth. By looking at the whole account, you can have a better, more informed theology. In Dignitatis Humanae, we can see Ressourcement showing up in the effort to ground religious freedom in the witness of the early church. In chapter 2, we find, from the very beginning of the church, the disciples of Christ strove to convert men to confess Christ as Lord, not, however, by applying coercion or the use of techniques unworthy of the gospel, but above all by the power of the word of God. Now, in this case, Ressourcement is, in some ways, trying to bypass more recent teaching by pulling on what's seen as better teaching from the fathers. Yves Congar, a key theologian at the council and a proponent of Ressourcement, noted that the conservatives were not fond of his approach. In his journal, when he's kind of recounting what happened at the council, he wrote, "My work displeases them because they realize very well that its whole aim is to bring back into circulation certain ideas, certain things that they have been endeavoring to shut out for 400 years. I think such a dynamic is certainly at play in this document. That is, we see an attempt to bring old voices back to the table to challenge more recent ones. In this case specifically, we're looking at church fathers and especially people in the pre-Nicene period who witnessed to what it was like to be the church when Christians are in the minority and don't have kind of the power of the empire at their back. In using old ideas to challenge newer ones, Ressourcement is often deeply linked with reform, and I think it's a really powerful tool in the church's theological toolkit. Finally, we have Aggiornamento, perhaps the most contested of the three key theological ideas at the council. It relates to the notion of updating. This can take two primary forms. First, there is the notion of simply updating language. For instance, Aristotelian philosophy had become unintelligible to many modern people at this time, so the council sought to adopt new language to say, in essence, the same things. That's the least radical view of Aggiornamento, and it aligns with the express goal of Pope John XXIII, who convoked the council and said in his opening speech that the task was to distinguish between the unchanging deposit of faith and the mode of presenting it, which can change. We can see some of this at play in Dignitatis Humanae, adopting kind of new ways of talking about government and people's rights, but I think largely speaking, we see a second, more radical form of Aggiornamento, which constitutes a genuine updating of teaching to reflect modern understanding. In fact, the document pretty much says as much when it states, "The declaration of this Vatican Council on man's right to religious freedom is based on the dignity of the person, the demands of which have become more fully known to human reason through centuries of experience." This line of thought can make people a bit uneasy, and I get why. Surely, they argue, this is simply the church bowing to the whims of the time. Maybe, but I think that reason always has a role to play in theology, and that there are things that we come to see more clearly due to changing contexts, and thus, Aggiornamento, when buttressed by Ressourcement and genuine development, is a good and necessary part of the theological task. We all have to do theology in the time and place we live. As Larry Chapp wittily writes of the situation at the council, Christendom was dead. Now what do? Stomp our feet and throw a neo-scholastic snit over how blind everyone else is besides ourselves? Pick up our monarchist marbles and walk away into some fanciful and romanticized medieval shire eating elf cakes as we await the day of our vindication? The Council Fathers understood that now was not the time for reactionary and antiquarian cosplaying at Renaissance and Baroque powdered wig political theatrics. I just thought that was fantastic. But that's what theology requires of us. It requires of us to address the time and place we live in, developing latent ideas, recovering lost ones, and also recognizing the needs and wisdom of the moment and time in which we live. Lest my vision of a reforming Catholic Church get carried away, it's important to note that this reading of the Second Vatican Council brings with it some major pitfalls. First, the move to avoid contradictions by appealing to the levels of Catholic teaching is inherent to Catholic theology, but at times it can appear a bit ad hoc. There have been theologians who argue that prior teachings on religious liberty were in fact infallible, and that would be a real problem. The challenge is that, for the most part, teachings don't come rubber-stamped with a level of authority on them, and this is especially true the further back you go. At times, you risk making these post hoc distinctions that seem so fine as to appear arbitrary, such that you can never really know whether something is infallible or not. Similarly, trying to distinguish between the core of a teaching and its secondary implications is more art than science. It seems plausible that if you really wanted to, one could maintain continuity between any two teachings by appealing to some more fundamental agreement between them. For instance, if one document said, killing humans is good, and another said, killing humans is bad, and you reconciled this by a more fundamental appeal to the notion that humans are worthy of moral consideration, you could be rightly accused of sophistry. For the record, though, I don't think Dignitatis Humanae is doing anything close to that example, but the danger of a slippery slope is worth acknowledging if I'm going to be honest about this theological method I'm proposing. Third, and probably the biggest challenge that comes out of this, is that once you accept that authentic teachings of the magisterium can change, as Guarino does, you can create a crisis of confidence in the magisterium. Here's why. Oftentimes people misunderstand Catholic teaching to be any teachings that aren't infallible are optional, but that's really not the case. While exercises of the authentic ordinary magisterium are reformable, they are simultaneously owed religious assent. If Vatican II can be rescued by an appeal to the reformability of the authentic ordinary magisterium, it does so at the cost of making clear that teachings to which you must submit could simultaneously be wrong or at least in serious need of improvement. And I think we see this crisis of confidence playing out today, in which many Catholics dissent from non-infallible teachings in ways that go well beyond the limits set up by the magisterium, as seen in documents like Veritatis Splendor. So, where do we go from here? I think Catholic theology has a few options. First, it can doggedly maintain that Vatican II was not in contradiction to previous teachings, even fallible ones. To me, that is not intellectually satisfying and would be ill-advised. Second, the Catholic Church can embrace a hermeneutic of reform, recognizing that doctrine is often much more tied to historical contingencies than previously thought. That isn't to say that theology is relative, but it is to say that our understanding is never conclusive and is open to further insight even when that insight reverses certain prior understandings or teachings. The key is that these reversals are always in service of more fundamental continuity with the core teaching of the gospel. I think this is the way forward. Cards on the table. Third, though, the Catholic Church can try to pretend that Vatican II didn't happen or use the language of it being a pastoral council to mean that it was doctrinally irrelevant, even against the clear insistence of multiple popes and prominent theologians to the opposite, that the documents are in fact due acceptance and embrace. I think this third way is likewise ill-advised. There's no going back to the Church of the Syllabus of Errors, Morari Vos, Mortali Animos, etc. Vatican II marked a significant change in direction and, well, the ship has sailed. If anything, I would agree with Rahner, Jacques, that ecumenical councils are the beginning, not the end of a conversation. What is needed, in my mind, is now an even wider ressourcement, a continued commitment to Aggiornamento, an embrace of authentic development, and a fervent commitment to the centrality of Christ and the message of the gospel. If the Catholic Church can do that, then I think the future, while admittedly probably pretty bumpy, could be quite bright.